Happy Tuesday. I'm sorry I'm coming to you a day late. I had a very busy Monday yesterday and just had meetings basically from time I got to church until the time I went home. So I'm coming to you today to talk a little bit more about Psalm 18. Now, because it's such a long psalm, what I did on Sunday was just try to take the major themes instead of having the time to go through verse by verse, and I just tried to summarize what each section was talking about. And kind of the centering around how it pointed us ultimately to Jesus, which I'll talk about a little bit in here. But I wanted to talk through some of the analogies or references that are made throughout this text, just to point out some of the things and emphases that David is trying to bring out. So the first one that I want to talk about, and again, some of these are just interesting things that I think are helpful to kind of frame how we read and interpret not just this psalm, but more psalms than just the one that we're studying right now. So, for example, in verse 2, David says, "My God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield, and the horn of my salvation." This idea of horn of salvation, I think it actually comes up again a little bit later. No, it's the shield of salvation. Never mind. But the horn of salvation comes up in other psalms, and what it's referring to is referring to like the horn of a bull. And so what David is talking about when you see this come up, even not just David, but in the Old Testament, it'll refer to someone like as strong as a horn, and so it's referring to something like a steer or a bull that has like a horn that comes out that can defeat, that can spear, that is very, very strong and very, very hard to beat. And so when it talks about this, it's just trying to find a way of using poetic language or examples to talk about the strength of God. So when it talks about the horn of our salvation, it's this strength that is connected to God's salvation that nothing else can come across. As I was talking to Kara about this after the message on Sunday, one of the things she said that she hadn't made the connection before is how all these stories and examples that David is talking about with the theophany section in verses 7 through some other places there are talking about previous events in Israel's history. Now, I also want to note that those things aren't just in the Bible for fun Sunday school stories. I think there's a tendency when I've talked to people to look at Noah's Ark or look at David and Goliath, my kids are obsessed with David and Goliath right now. Every time, they've got 3 or 4 or 5 different kids' Bibles, and they are just obsessed with going and finding the David story in all of them, and then they take it and reenact it in their own lives. One gets to be David, one gets to be Goliath, they flip-flop, all that stuff. But those aren't just in there for us to teach our kids Sunday school stories. They're in there for a reason and for a purpose. So similarly here, we need to be thinking and contemplating and meditating on the ways God has worked throughout history. It's not just for our kids to learn the stories and then we move to the so-called advanced topics. These are there for us to be reminded and to embed ourselves in the history of how God has worked from the dawn of creation and will continue working on into eternity. Another thing that was just interesting that stood out to me in this text, verse 34 talks about what God does for us. It says, "He trains my hands for war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze." Now, if you've ever seen like a giant statue of marble or bronze, or even if you've ever tried to pull a bow and arrow back, it's really, really hard. There was someone at one of the churches I served at who was actually an Olympian archer, and so she had the opportunity to travel around the country to various places. Was at an event with Arnold Schwarzenegger one time and asked him to pull her bow back, and he physically could not pull it back, which just goes to show you how difficult it is to pull a bow and arrow back. So David, with God's equipping, is able to do these unbelievable things like bending a bow of bronze. Now, if you could actually bend a bow of bronze, it would be useless. So it's just, again, David is using poetic imagery to try to get across the idea that God's strengthening and equipping is so far beyond anything we could ever do in our own strength. The last thing I wanted to point out, verse 49 is actually quoted again in Romans 15, verse 9. So I just wanted to read that verse to you quickly. That's Paul is writing, "In order that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy, as it is written, therefore I will praise you among the Gentiles and sing to you your name." So when I got to the end of the message this past week, I talked about how one of the things David is pointing to is David's greater son, Jesus. And Paul explicitly is making that connection here in Romans chapter 15. So this verses, really like 47 through 49 is kind of dealing with this theme of how David has seen deliverance over his enemies, how all the other nations have bowed the knee to him and his rule and reign in their lives. Now, we know he didn't rule the entire world, so this is again pointing to Jesus, but Paul is making this explicit connection that what David is pointing to is the way that Jesus, when he comes to earth, is going to rule and reign over every ethnicity. So where David was limited in scope to just a specific socioeconomic, a specific geographic location, Jesus isn't limited by any of that. And so now Jesus rules over every nation in the world. And then another thing that I wanted to point out in the last verse, it says it shows his steadfast love to his anointed. That's that Hebrew word, once again, hesed, that if you haven't ever done a word study on that, I'd encourage you to go look it up and see all the connotations that come along with that throughout the Old Testament. It's like covenant faithfulness, his steadfast love towards those whom God has chosen, and the word in this one is anointed. So, there's a ton more that we could go through in here. There's even verse 8 has this funny illustration that I just thought was funny from Hebrew that talks about smoke going up from someone's nostrils. So it's talking about your nose actually getting hot. So when you get angry, it talks about your nose getting hot. So just there's these funny stories and idioms that come out in some of the languages that we have a tendency to meet. And there's all sorts of those things you can find throughout the Psalms. But I'd encourage you, continue reading through it and studying it. Now, what's coming up? This next Sunday is our last Sunday in the Psalms for the summer. So I've already started studying Psalm chapter 20. So after we get through Psalm 20 on August is it 28th, I believe, whatever the last Sunday of the month is, we're going to begin our fall series looking at the book of Ephesians. So we just got journal Bibles in, so we'll have those out on Sunday for you. Again, I'd encourage you, if you are going to grab one, please make sure you are planning to use it for our fall sermon series. If you aren't going to use it, please don't grab it. Don't just take it because it's free. Trying to get these so they're a helpful resource for you. If you like writing notes in your Bible, but you run out of space frequently, then take one of those journal Bibles just as a way for you to easily look back and maybe even in the future you can look back and flip through and see what it was God was teaching you at this specific time and season in your life. So we're just going to walk through the book of Ephesians together this fall, then that will take us up to Christmas. And at that point, I'm going to do a sermon series looking at discipleship. What is discipleship? What's the point? What's the purpose? How do we go about being more intentional with our equipping in our body and some of those various implications of discipleship in the life of the church. So that's where we're going. So this week Psalm 18, next week Psalm 20, then Ephesians for 3 months, and then we'll be looking at a series on discipleship before we enter a brand new year. It's crazy to think that we're most over halfway done with 2022, and 2023 feels like it's just around the corner. So we'll be back again with you with Psalm 20 this coming week, and then we'll be done with our summer series. I hope it has been encouraging and edifying to you once again. If there is anything that has stood out to you, I would love to hear about it over this summer studying these 10 Psalms together.